Okay, so we are at a bit of a transitional period in the class right now. We're going to be transitioning from inner plant structure to cultural conditions. Okay, so the inner plant structure, we've been talking about um, different types of plant cells, different types of systems within the plant, how water moves through a plant, etc. Now we're going to be talking about nutrient roles in plants and a couple ways to increase nutrients in soil, okay, just very lightweight. And this gives us a good transition from that inner plant of what the function and form of the interior workings and systems of the plant are, and then transitioning to what the plant needs from a cultural standpoint, okay? So look at, before we make that transition, or as we're making that transition, we're looking at what the nutrient roles are in plants. So diving into essential nutrients, we have a couple different types of essential nutrients. The first set are needed in greater quantity, and those are considered macronutrients. And then there's micronutrients that are needed by the plant for all sorts of things. However, they're needed in far less quantity. Okay, so if we're talking about macronutrients, the primary ones that we typically talk about and that we see on fertilizer bags are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There's also a couple other less talked about macronutrients, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. Okay, but they're all macronutrients. We primarily talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But again, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium are all needed at decent quantities, so they are considered macronutrients. The micronutrients, on the other hand, are again needed in lower quantities, but still required by the plant. So when we look at these macronutrients, again, we have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We have NPK. And we also have sulfur, calcium, and magnesium as macronutrients. But again, in the world of horticulture and nurseries and landscaping, typically we're primarily focused on the NPK. Now, when we look at a bag of fertilizer, there's always three numbers on it. Okay, always three numbers on it. And those three numbers correlate to the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So in this bag, this 21,320 means by weight, this bag is 21% nitrogen, 3% phosphorus, and 20% potassium. So here we have 21% of 50 pounds is 10.5 pounds of nitrogen. 3% of 50 pounds is 1.5% nitrogen. And 20% potassium in a 50-pound bag is 10 pounds of potassium. Okay, so this helps us to figure out how much fertilizer, how much each macronutrient we're applying to a given area. And we will go through some fertilizer calculations. So in looking at these essential nutrients, there's the typical number in this label. It's a 26,412 fertilizer, which means 26% nitrogen, 4% phosphate, and 12% potash. Okay, so number one tells us our percentage nitrogen. Number two tells us our percentage phosphate. And number three tells us our percentage potash or potassium. If there's any significant amount of nutrients beyond the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, it will typically be listed next. Okay? In this case, there's 1.5% combined sulfur. Now, this number 5 here says, and these asterisks note a footnote here that says 19.4% slowly available nitrogen from methylene ureas and IBDU. Okay, so what this actually means is it gives you that there is 19.4% slow release nitrogen in here. Okay, slow release nitrogen. So the slow release nitrogens are the water insoluble nitrogen and then other water soluble nitrogens. Okay, water insoluble nitrogen and other water soluble nitrogens. So the other nitrogen, the 5.6, I guess 6.6% of the nitrogen in here, the ammoniacal nitrogen and the urea nitrogen, these are forms of nitrogen that are immediately available to the plant, immediately available. So these are in forms that once they're in water, once they're soluble in water, they are available to the plant. Okay, so this is actually a much better way to approach fertilizing in a conventional way, where you're not putting down all 100% available nitrogen for immediate uptake by the plant, utilizing a fertilizer that has some water insoluble nitrogens or slow release nitrogens. It's typically better for the plant, and well, we'll get into like whether it's actually better or not, but it is typically better for the plant to get a slow and steady amount of nitrogen as opposed to a huge immediate blast, and it's for a number of reasons. So this, I don't know what this, I can't remember what this fertilizer label came from, what the actual fertilizer was, but this is a really good fertilizer for a conventional fertilizer for fertilizing lawns. And we'll get into the give and take on that and the pluses, the good things about it and the bad things about it. But this is that. So this last statement here, number 7, says 3.2% ammoniacal nitrogen, quick release, immediately available to the plant, and some sulfur provide fast early green up, okay, of lawn. So this is actually a good fertilizer, conventional fertilizer. And again, we will get into whether conventional fertilizers are actually good or not. But if we're talking about just strictly the health of the plant and the performance of the plant, this is actually a really good fertilizer for use in really early spring, late winter. Okay, so it essentially gets that grass to green up relatively quickly using a combination of immediately available ammoniacal nitrogen and sulfur. Now let's look at, well, I guess let me jump back here. This chart here gives us the major functions of these macro and micronutrients. Okay, so for example, our nitrogen found in proteins, nucleic acids, etc. Our phosphorus is found in nucleic acids, ATP. ATP, if we zip back and think to some of those more technical descriptions of photosynthesis, ATP is an active part of photosynthesis. So having phosphorus, available phosphorus, is required for photosynthesis. Okay, let's see, potassium, enzyme activation, water balance, ion balance, stomatal opening. Remember, we did talk about that. Essentially, the guard cells will have higher or lower or certain concentrations of potassium in them. And when there's a higher concentration or higher ratio of potassium to water, and there's water within those guard cells, and there's water available, then water will cross through the cell membrane and go into, through osmosis, go into those guard cells and puff them up and make them more turgid. Okay, so this is sort of how all of these nutrients work within the plant. And this is a more technical table in regards to what the function within the plant is. Okay, there's a big part of me that understands that this is very important to understand. Okay, this is very important to understand if you are in botany or going on to do some sort of research, etc. Okay, it's very important for those intents and purposes. For intro to horticulture, in my opinion, we want to know what the nitrogen does for the plant, not necessarily every single reaction that happens within the plant. Okay, so we're going to look at the essential nutrients, what they actually mean, and what they do for the plant. So nitrogen, it promotes plant growth and development. Okay, so that is vegetative growth, protein production, and photosynthesis. Symptoms of deficiency of nitrogen deficiency in plants is stunted growth, pale yellow leaves, starting in the older leaves first, and typically starting from the tips of those leaves moving inward. Okay, inward. If we look at phosphorus, phosphorus is used in photosynthesis. Remember, technical, in photosynthesis and respiration, energy storage, root development, flower initiation, seed, and fruiting. Symptoms of deficiencies, you get slow, weak, and stunted growth. Under severe deficiencies, you can get purpling of the leaves and stems in some plants. Remember, though, that sometimes purpling of leaves is an inherent attribute or characteristic of a particular cultivated variety. Okay. Let's see, you can get delayed maturity and poor seed and fruit development. You can get browning or scorching and curling of leaf tips, as well as chlorosis. And this chlorosis is yellowing of leaves, And the way that the leaves yellow, the way that the leaves develop chlorosis can tell you something about what nutrient it may be lacking. So with the nitrogen here, we have pale yellow leaves starting in older leaves first and starting from the tip. So you can see younger leaves here are quite green, and the older leaves are quite yellow and relatively uniformly yellow. You can't see in this picture, but you would imagine that the yellowing would start from the tip and start to head this direction. Okay. Now, the phosphorus, you can see here that leaf tips as well as chlorosis, okay, scorching and curling of leaf tips. So here you get some scorching and curling of leaf tips, as well as chlorosis, so that yellowing between leaf veins. So here, blow this up for you. You can see that there's chlorosis, but adjacent to the veins, there's still green to it, okay? So this is a relatively good indicator that it may be phosphorus, low in phosphorus. Potassium is needed for metabolism, disease resistance. It's a major factor in guard cell function. And it promotes translocation of sugars in plants for storage and function. Okay, so potassium, again, plays a major role in making sure that cells are doing what they're supposed to do in storage in different sorts of functions. And a lot of the function of, or the reason that potassium is there, is to sort of work with concentrations of potassium within certain cells. And when there's higher concentration of potassium in relation to the water, then water tends to, through osmosis, travel into that cell. Okay, so that's a big part of it. Now, symptoms of deficiency, again, you can get chlorosis, okay, yellowing of leaves, chlorosis, at older leaf edges. Okay, so the older leaves on the edges around the margin are yellow with potassium deficiencies. Interveinal chlorosis with phosphorus deficiencies, and then relatively uniform chlorosis with nitrogen deficiencies. This right here is a link to ASU, and we're just gonna skip the verification there. This is just here for you. This does go through all of the macronutrients, the symptoms of deficiencies, and then if you're looking for fertilizers and the sources, you're looking for certain words. Okay, so I find this table to be really, really helpful because it goes through, this is what you may be seeing, okay, some additional comments regarding what you may be seeing, and then if you're looking for a fertilizer to correct the issue, these are the words you're looking for, okay? So that's just there for you. I'm not testing you on it or anything. So here is a really typical one: nitrogen deficiency in turf or lawn. The symptom is chlorosis. And let's just say that the potential cause is leaching. Okay, so if we look at this as sort of side by side, obviously the cultural conditions are exactly the same as far as we can tell. It looks like full sun, slight slope, dense coverage of lawn species, right? And there's a lot of different lawn species or turf species, everything from warm season grasses to cool season grasses, from Bermudas and kikuyas and zoysias, right? A lot of grasses that tend to travel, right? And we've talked about Bermuda when we're talking about rhizomes and stolons. And again, we talked about the fact that in the Sacramento region, Northern California, we don't like Bermuda because it goes dormant in the summertime or in the wintertime. It's a warm season grass. Whereas there's a lot of areas, Southern California and the Southwest, that because the temperatures are so mild during the wintertime, there's generally not a true dormancy period for Bermuda. Anyways, that's a side note. So we're just looking at a grass here, okay? And we're saying, well, okay, well, here's the problem. We're noticing some chlorosis. We're noticing yellowing of leaves and relatively uniform yellowing of leaves. And what could the cause be? Well, in this case, cause could be a lot of things, but in this case, we're just going to say that the cause could be leaching. Now, what is leaching? Leaching occurs when nutrients are pushed through the soil to a depth beyond the root zone, so that those available nutrients are no longer available to the plant because they aren't within reach of the roots. They aren't in contact with the roots. They're too deep. They've been leached below the surface. I'm sorry, below the plant's ability to utilize those nutrients. This happens a lot in sandier soils. And in the Sacramento region, there's areas with very sandy soil, and this can be a problem. There's also areas in the greater Sacramento area that have heavy clay soils or loamy soils, etc. So leaching is typically problematic in sandier soils. Okay, sandier soils do not have a wonderful ability to hold on to nutrients, and they don't have a wonderful ability to hold on to water either. Okay, whereas clay soils have this incredible ability to hold water and nutrients, but typically in a way that makes it challenging for plant growth. Okay, so if we have a symptom of chlorosis and the cause is leaching, what could the solution be? Well, let's fertilize, right? And again, we're going to get, when we talk about soils, we're going to get really into the soil food web, I guess, again, lightly, but we will talk about the active biological life within soils and what fertilizing does if you take certain methods of fertilizing. Typically, conventional methods of fertilizing are not good for life in the soil. But so I guess I'm prefacing all of this with that statement, okay? What we're doing in this lecture is we're looking at what certain nutrients do in plants, do for plants, how it helps plants respire and photosynthesize, etc., and what those symptoms are, and then how you actually execute it. Okay, we're sort of shelving preserving soil and focusing on soil health for now. Okay, major point here is that we understand what these nutrients are, what they do for the plant, how we execute, how we come up with quantities. And later in the semester, we will get into the best way to do it for a number of reasons. So right now we're sort of looking primarily at conventional approaches. Let's fertilize, right? Like that's what we're doing. But just know in the back of your head that, and even in this lecture, we will get into some alternatives, and we will kind of extensively talk about why it's so important to focus on the alternatives as opposed to conventional fertilizers. Okay, and there's some major reasons. But again, for now, and you can tell it's difficult, I'm going to shelf that just so that we can talk about nutrients. Okay, so we're going to fertilize. We've got a problem. It's nitrogen deficient. The solution is fertilize that thing. How much, when, how often? Okay, that's the question. And generally, like maybe the question that you've had in the past, a lot of times with my clients, this is a question, excuse me, that I get from them a lot. They want to know, how much do I put down? What do I put down? When do I do it? How often do I do it? Right. And unfortunately, like you can come up with some like, yeah, okay, do this in fall, do this in spring, do this in summer, right? You can figure that out, but it depends on a lot of things. Okay. It's not typically like just a, silver bullet, here's the fix for everything. Okay. It depends on the soil, on the solar exposure, on the plant species, on available nutrients within the soil already, why they might or might not be tied up, etc. Okay. So lots and lots and lots to it. Let's dive into the what to do here. We're going to fertilize. Typically, if we're looking at the how much portion, this is the biggest myth piece, right? And a lot of times if you buy these bags of fertilizer, you see that covers 12,000 square feet, right? And with a 50-pound bag, okay? So you could do some math for that. Now, again, here we've got our nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. If we zoomed in on this, it's going to tell us like where that came from. Let's see, what do we got here? That's a little too hard for me to read. Okay, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a very typical application to lawn is 1 pound nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. 1 pound nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Now, in this case, that's pretty much what this is stating, right? If this says that it covers 12,000 square feet and there's 24% nitrogen in a 50-pound bag, that means that there's 12 pounds of nitrogen. And if it's 1 pound per square foot, then you need 12 pounds to cover 12,000 square feet, right? Now, this one's pretty simple, but here again, to go through this, 24% nitrogen by weight. That means that there's 24 pounds in a 100 pound of fertilizer. That previous one was 50. Let's look at a 100-pound bag of fertilizer. Fertilizer application rates, the actual application rate is determined by whoever's managing this. So you, as you become a horticultural professional, you will be that manager. You will be making that decision if you choose to go into landscape maintenance, turf care, golf course, sports fields, etc. And again, typically, this is expressed as a number of pounds nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And the typical rate is 1 pound per 1,000 square feet. Okay, so we want to determine, given what we've got, the number of pounds of fertilizer to use per 1,000 square feet. So we take the pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet desired, right? So if we want 1 pound per 1,000 square feet, then we are going to take 1 pound per 1,000 square feet, so our 1 pound nitrogen, and divide it by the percent nitrogen expressed as a decimal. So here's the example. Our rate that we wanted was 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So we take 1 pound and we divide it by the percentage of nitrogen expressed as a decimal. Okay, so 24% nitrogen. Oops, 24% nitrogen. What did I do there? What did that happen? So we've got our 24% nitrogen. We're going to zip back down here. So we're going to call that 0.24. 24% expressed as a decimal is 0.24. So we take 1 pound, divide it by 0.24, and we get 4.16 pounds of fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. So what does that mean? That means that in order to put 24%, in order to put 1 pound of fertilizer down per 1,000 of 1 pound of nitrogen down per 1,000 square feet, we need to weigh out 4.16 pounds of this fertilizer. So we take this fertilizer, put a bucket on a scale, fill that bucket up until the scale reads 4.16. And within that, we know that we have 1 pound of nitrogen, and we need to spread that uniformly on the 1,000 square feet. Okay. Now, spreading it uniformly is not the easiest thing in the world, but it's doable. Fertilizer spreaders, a calibrated fertilizer spreader is how you actually do it. Okay. You get used to it. It's not difficult to do, but you do need to calibrate it and make sure that on the lawn, on that area, that 4.16 pounds of the fertilizer is uniformly distributed throughout that 1,000 square feet. How often and when do we do it? Okay. Now, typically late winter, early spring, okay, as plants are coming out of the cooler season and a slower respiration, once temperatures start coming up in the air and soil temperatures start coming up, it will start to vegetatively grow more rapidly. During those times, we want to make sure that we have an adequate amount of nitrogen and an adequate amount of other macronutrients and sulfur, remember, for that early green up. Okay. Now, early summer, okay, you may need to add some more depending on how much insoluble, slow release nitrogen is in that bag. Okay. And then again, midsummer, right? So figuring out when and how often is really going to depend on what the intent is, what the desired results need to be. Okay. So a good approach would be fertilize at low quantities often, as opposed to high quantities at low frequency. So a less expensive approach to lawn care is less use of fertilizer, right? It's expensive to apply fertilizers because there's man hours involved and materials involved. It's better for the plant to apply a little bit on an ongoing basis, but it's more expensive to do that. So inherently, to get things to be less expensive, which typical consumers appreciate and look for, the general move is not late winter, early spring, early summer, midsummer, and fall, right? Frequently. The approach is early spring and fall, twice a year. Okay. Now, along with that, you end up with a lot of stuff in that fertilizer that may be detrimental to the life in the soil, which again, we'll get to, but you can tell I'm chomping at the bit. So if we're looking at these sort of heavy growth periods of the season, we're going to need things that are good for vegetative growth, good for respiration, good for photosynthesis, good for stomatal function, etc. Okay. Once we get down to early fall, when plants are sort of like tail end of hot season, starting to maybe go into dormancy, then we're looking at fertilizer or nutrients that are more active in, bring this is actually a better example. So a little bit higher potassium rates and a little bit higher phosphorus rates. Okay. So the reason that in early fall that we'd be looking to have lower nitrogen and higher phosphorus and potassium is primarily because phosphorus plays an active role in energy storage and root development. Okay. And potassium promotes translocation of sugars in plants, storage and function, and disease resistance. Okay. So later in the season, so early fall and through fall, really, we're not trying to get heavy vegetative growth out of it. We're trying to get that plant to prepare itself and have the resources immediately available to prepare itself for going into slower respiration or dormancy during the winter. Okay. Where was I? So again, higher phosphorus and potassium fertilizers in early fall. Now, are shrubs and trees treated the exact same way? Sort of, right? For the most part. Typically, they're fertilized during active growth and when water's available in the soil for nutrient uptake. So trees and shrubs are, yes, they are treated with fertilizers. but not necessarily in the same way as lawn. The application is a little bit different. The way that you deliver those nutrients can be very different. For instance, for shrubs, a lot of times instead of going in with a calibrated spreader, we are taking some lower concentrated fertilizers and we're spreading those around those shrubs and working those into the soil to some degree. Now, trees, okay, it can be quite difficult to get nutrients into trees. Why? Because their roots are really deep in the soil. So how do you deliver that fertilizer way down to those roots to be able to take that fertilizer up? Well, a lot of times, just like we talked about with bamboo, right? The active roots, right, that are taking in nutrients and spreading, are within the top 12 to 18 inches of the soil, whereas the roots that are really searching for anchoring and for water are found a little bit lower in the soil profile or deeper in that soil profile. Okay, but you don't treat it necessarily the same way. Again, just like with the shrubs, you can do a spreading around the root zone and then a work into the soil and then a drenching with water to drive it down to that root zone, to leach it down to the root zone, but not beyond the root zone. There's also other things that can be done with trees. You can do direct injections of fertilizers. You can literally drill a hole into a tree and inject it with fertilizers and put it right into the xylem stream, okay? That is delivering nutrients and water throughout that plant. Okay, so you can do this, and this can be really effective, like for plants, for trees especially, that are in dire need of some specific nutrient. You can correct it really quickly with direct injections. Okay, and you see that a lot with um, uh, um, tree services, that they will do fertilizers. The other way that you can do it is you can do direct injections into the soil. It's interesting, like it, and it works, that's for sure. What they're actually using, is the important thing. Now, what are the alternatives to these conventional fertilizers that, by the way, are typically petroleum based? They're essentially soluble salts. Okay, they're essentially soluble salts. The reason that we need them to be soluble salts is so that they're able to go soluble in water, to dissolve in water, and be taken up by the roots, by the plant themselves. Alternatives: cover crops, compost tea, organic fertilizers, compost, and grass cycling. Okay, so alternatives. First one we're going to look at is cover crops. Now, cover crops are a planting of legumes that are typically high in nitrogen from rhizobia. Okay, rhizobia is a bacteria. Those crops must be worked into the soil to become available for future crops. Okay, so rhizobia is a bacteria found in the roots of legumes, also found in some other plants too. These are plants that have relationships with rhizobia, such as peas, vetch, clover, and alfalfa. It converts into to NH4. It's nitrogen fixing. Let me zip back up here. NH4. Okay, so that NH4 and the NO3, those are both available nutrients, right? Those are available forms of nitrogen that the plant can take up. Sorry, I'm zipping back to this one. N2 is nitrogen that's in air. Okay, we have nitrogen in the air we breathe. Now, what rhizobia is capable of doing is converting nitrogen from the air into a nitrogen that a plant can take up. right? How about that for a relationship? So the NH4 is taken up by the plants to make amino acids, which become proteins. Okay, so essentially, with cover crops, this is an excellent approach. A lot of the cover crops mentioned here, peas, vetch, clover, alfalfa. What's another one? Fava beans do it. They're nitrogen fixing. So a lot of these plants that are nitrogen fixing, that have rhizobia in them, in the roots essentially, if you plant them in the winter, it could be a crop that you could pull from. So if you plant some fava beans in a garden bed during the winter, you can utilize those fava beans, and then when it's ready to plant and that plant is in decline, you don't pull that plant out, you actually push it right into the soil. You turn it into the soil. So worked into the soil. And then it's also available for future crops. Okay, so it's making a bunch of nitrogen available, and it's organic material itself, it gets pushed into the soil. Okay, so this is a great way to be able to do some farming, and especially, utilizing in urban farming, where you get a crop down during sort of a down period of the season that provides some sort of benefits from a crop production standpoint, but also for future production standpoints. And there's a ton of research that's been done, is being done, and there's many, many farms that are called no-till farms. No-till farms. And what the goal of that is, typically they're using a lot of cover crops. They're using a lot of different methods to make sure that their soils are high in nutrients and high in organic matter. They don't remove plants. They will either work them back into the soil without tilling, or they will cut them off at the base, leaving the roots in place. Now, what that does is it leaves the organic matter in the soil and feeds organic life in that soil. Okay, now the reason that they're not tilling is because when you till, you disturb the life in the soil. The life is still there. You don't necessarily kill it by tilling, but you destroy the network and system that bacterial and fungal and biological life has created within that soil. Okay, now zip on back here. Remember, conventional fertilizers, soluble salts, and this sounds disgusting, but I always use it because it's effective. What happens when you pour salt on a slug? We all know what happens when you pour salt on a slug. Ewy, gooey, bubbly, right? Yuck, right? But what's actually happening? If you think back to that osmosis thing and higher concentrations of salts and water translocating or relocating to find a uniform distribution of salts, that's exactly what's happening. Salt on a slug, it's a soft-bodied animal. The water from within the slug starts to go outside of that slug to dilute the concentrations of salts. So if we are fertilizing with chemical, petroleum-based fertilizers, we are feeding the plant, but at the same time, significantly hindering the ability of the biological life in the soil from sustaining itself. We're essentially pouring salt on those slugs. They're all soft-bodied animals in the ground there. Okay, so adding salts is a bad thing. So no-till farms utilizing cover crops to increase available nitrogen within the soil. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to do this. This is one of them. Another way to do it is using compost and mulch. Compost is the end product resulting from the controlled biological decomposition of organic material from a feedstock into a stable, humus-like product that has many environmental benefits. Key things here: controlled biological decomposition, humus. What is humus? What is humus? So humus is a dark organic material that forms in soil when plant and animal matter decays. For instance, when plants drop leaves, twigs, and other material from that plant to the ground, it piles up. This material is called leaf litter, right? Or leaves or twigs. When animals die, their remains add to that litter. And that decomposition of that matter becomes humus. Now, if you aren't already familiar with humus, but you've walked through a forest before, okay, and I'm hoping that the majority of you have, but when you walk through a forest, and I always like to use the example of a redwood forest. When you walk through a redwood forest, usually that ground is very soft and cushy. Redwood forests, tropical forests too, are really well known for having thick humic layers, thick layers of humus. And as you walk through that and you're sort of bouncing on that material, which if normal people would look at it and say that's dirt, right? Well, look at that material. On the surface, you're going to see some redwood leaves and twigs. You're going to see other plant leaves and twigs. You may see a worm here and there. You may see some other parts of things that you aren't quite sure. Now move that portion aside, get a couple inches down further into the quote unquote dirt. Well, what you'll see within that is you're still going to see a couple little twigs here and there. You're going to see something that resembles dirt, but there's more in it. It's usually dark in color, dark and rich in color. And what that is organic material that forms in soil when plant and animal matter decays. And at that point, you can no longer look at it and say, that was a redwood leaf and that is a redwood twig. You may be able to see a little woody, sticky kind of thing, right? But you can't look at it and say, that's from a ribes and that's from a this. It's decomposing. And what decomposes it? Bacteria and fungi, primarily bacteria and fungi, but also worms and all sorts of other biological life in the soil. Okay, so humus, that's what humus is. Humus is a dark organic material that forms in soil when plant and animal matter decays. Compost is the end product resulting from the controlled biological decomposition of organic material from a feedstock into a stable humus-like product that has many environmental benefits. So compost is our version, our human version, our controlled biological decomposition process of creating humus. And why is this beneficial? Well, think about it. Mother Nature figured this out a really long time before we figured out how to make chemical fertilizers using petroleum, right? Mother Nature figured this out. Well, there's nutrients in plants, right? There's nutrients in animals. And as these things live and die and live and die and live and die, they end up on the soil. And what's within the soil? Within the soil, we have minerals, we have air, we have water, and we have biological life. And that biological life decomposes the plants and animals that have passed on and break them down into the soil, providing a nutrient-rich soil. So adding good quality compost before planting turf, annuals, perennials, trees, shrubs, etc., brings life to the soil and helps plants thrive. And the real key here is feed the soil, not the plant. In turn, the soil will feed the plant. Okay. When we're using products like this, we're feeding the plant. We're not feeding the soil. Okay. So these alternatives are working with what Mother Nature developed and figuring out how to increase it, encourage it, enhance it. Organic matter, compost, acts like a sponge, helping to retain more soil moisture. Okay, so let me give you an example of the benefits there. In 1 cubic foot of mineral soil, 1 cubic foot of mineral soil, there's a certain amount of water that soil is capable of holding within it, depending on its soil textural class. A soil textural class is a sandy soil, a loamy soil, a silty soil, a clay soil. Okay, clay soils, I mentioned a couple minutes ago, can hold a lot of water. Okay, they're very capable of holding on to a lot of water, whereas sandy soils, remember, we get leaching. Because the soil particles are so large, water tends to flow right through it, right? You pour water into the sand at a beach, it's going to go right through it, right? It's not going to hold on to it. Now, that cubic foot of soil has the capability, based on its soil textural class, to hold on to a certain amount of water. Add 1% organic matter to that 1 cubic foot of soil. So add some compost to it. Bring it up to a 1% content of organic matter. It now can hold 1 entire quart more than it could before of water. Bring it up to 2%, it can hold 2 more quarts of water. So in that single cubic foot of mineral soil, for every 1% more organic matter that's added to that soil, it is capable of holding 1 additional quart of water. Okay. Organic matter in compost acts like a sponge, helping to retain more soil moisture. Compost helps improve soil problems, in particular those that are compacted, heavy clay, or sandy, poor in nutrients, or contaminated with lead. The way that this works is, with clay soils, typically they're considered heavy soils. If you've ever worked in a clay soil and tried to grow a lot of plants in a clay soil, you know that it's challenging. The reason it's challenging is, while it can hold on to a lot of water, it's typically a very dense or heavy soil. And so the problem becomes not necessarily water not being available, although there are some oddities with it. The problem becomes that the soil is so dense and compact that the roots have a hard time penetrating it. Well, add compost to that soil, and the first thing that you see happen is, even if you just put it on top, which is actually generally my recommendation, but depends on what you're doing and what the conditions are, et cetera. It always depends. It just depends. What ends up happening is worms show up and they start gobbling up a little bit of that organic matter. And those worms dive down into the soil a little bit. And I like layman's terms, so we'll just put it this way. Those worms poop that organic matter out, but worms don't fully digest material. They partially digest. Okay, so they go up and grab that organic material and they go a little bit deeper into that soil, and then they poop that partially digested organic matter out deeper in the soil profile where fungi are, where bacteria are. And in turn, that feeds the fungi and bacteria. Fungi can there's ways that they actually reach up and can just grab that organic matter and start breaking down in place. But the worms really deliver it deeper. Okay. So adding organic matter in the form of compost can significantly improve heavy clay soils. Now, sandy soils, remember, those inherently leach, right? They can't hold on to water, and nutrients, available nutrients, leach right through them beyond the root zone. Adding organic matter to clay soils improves water holding capacity and cation exchange capacity, which is a measure of how well a soil can hold on to nutrients. Clay has a high cation exchange capacity. Sandy soils have a very low cation exchange capacity. Add compost or organic material to that sandy soil, you increase its water holding capacity and you increase its cation exchange capacity. Therefore, more available water for plants and more available nutrients for a longer period of time for those plants. Goes without saying, incorporating compost into landscapes is one of the most important practices for healthy landscapes. Okay, so compost. Ways that we can do this: we can top dress. We can top dress existing planting areas with fine screen compost. We can even top dress lawns with compost. Okay, you aerate the lawn and then spread compost over that aerated lawn, a fine screen compost, and rake it in, and that will deliver compost deeper into that soil profile, which delivers all these amazing things. Okay, so since we're talking about compost, let's dive into, where did I put it? Let's dive into someone else, organic compost analysis. Now, when you get compost, you can ask for this. If a compost is being sold at a retail location, it has to go through the U.S. Composting Council's seal of testing assurance. Okay, it's the U.S. Composting Council's STA. It's tested, and it has to be tested frequently. And this is the information that you get back from it. When this facility sent off its compost, it had a moisture content of 32%. It had an organic matter content of 65.5%. Its pH was 7.81, which is a little bit high, but decent. It states its particle sizes, its maturity level, and we'll get in later in the semester. We'll get in later into the maturity level of composts, and when using an immature compost is maybe appropriate or potentially incredibly detrimental. Okay. The reason for that is an immature compost is really high in ammonia. The way that you can tell that it's high in ammonia is you smell it. Literally, if you've never smelt an immature compost before and you don't know what it smells like, if you just keep in the back of your head that if you smell it, you're going to smell ammonia, and you're like, what does that smell like? Trust me, when you smell it, you will know. Okay, it's an ammonia smell that hits the back of your nose like a punch. Okay, you go, oh, that's immature. What that means is that it's still actively decomposing, and it's got really high levels of ammonia in it. Really high levels of ammonia in it. Let's zip on back here really quick so I can show you something. Ammonia. Remember, the ammonia is the quick release, high nitrogen. Now, that can be good for some things. It can actually be beneficial for some things, but for a lot of other things, it's very, very bad, especially many of the soft chaparral California natives. They don't like a lot of ammonia. Okay, now a mature compost is typically doesn't have a heavy ammonia smell, and it smells like sweet earth. It just smells like a concentrated sweet earth. An overly mature compost will basically smell like nothing. Okay, now there are some uses for that. And typically when it's overly mature, there's incredibly low levels of nitrogen. And so in that case, it can be good for those soft chaparral California natives. that prefer low to no nitrogen. Okay, it's essentially making a low nitrogen compost. Okay, so here's all the things, and this is sort of the big one to make it retail sellable. These pathogens, fecal coliform and salmonella, it passed. Okay, these are the really important pieces. Also, passed trace metals, which is typically a measure of pollutants and other like heavy metals within soils that we don't want in our soils. It also gives us a nutrient analysis. Okay, so percent by dry weight was 0.79% nitrogen, 0.3 phosphorus, 0.52 potassium, 1.8 calcium, high in calcium, 0.38 in magnesium, right? Only one that's not showing up here is sulfur, right? But remember, these are our primary macronutrients, right? And so it gives us a breakdown of that and what's actually in that compost. And there's nutrients in the compost, and that's why I'm giving it to you as an alternative to chemical fertilizers. But they also test to make sure that essentially it's gone through its certain levels of heat, which kills out weed seeds or any seeds, makes it so that they won't germinate. It kills them because it gets to a high enough temperature. Okay, so now if you go to buy compost at like a bulk supply vendor, chances are the guy or girl in the tractor that's loading it up into the trailer isn't going to have this testing report on hand. But if you ask the manager, right, or the office for the compost technical data sheet, you should get it. And typically they're tested at least 3 times a year. Okay, at least 3 times a year. Slowed down a little bit during COVID, but we've recovered from that. So anyways, compost, excellent alternative to fertilizers. Now, if you can't necessarily use compost, right, it's a kind of a solid material, right? You can do things like a compost tea. Now, compost tea is essentially compost soaked in water, which releases a lot of the nutrients as well as bacteria, okay, the beneficial bacteria. So really simply, you can soak compost in a bucket and then filter it through some sort of colander or netting, okay, to get the solids out. And what ends up down in here, you can drench, apply to soil around plants. You can also put it into a sprayer and you can do foliar applications with it, where you're essentially applying a high nutrient rich water onto the plant itself, which will be absorbed into the plant. Okay. Now, typically you can buy, there are places that make actively aerated compost tea. This is not actively aerated compost tea here. This is just a simple sort of backyard approach. Totally works, right? But you need to use it quickly. So you're essentially going to soak it overnight, filter it the next day, and then spray it on the plants immediately. Now, if people are selling compost tea, great way to do it is through active aeration. This is a little fun diagram I found on the World Wide Interweb somewhere, but what this is pumping air through air stones, just like you have in an aquarium. Essentially, it's getting some oxygen bubbles to go through here, and you put some compost in some sort of sack in there, some sort of water penetrable sack, a nylon stocking in this case, right? And so you actively aerate it overnight for 24 hours, up to 24 hours. And then at that point, what that's doing is all the beneficial bacteria, all the good bacteria, they utilize oxygen for their respiration. They're aerobic bacteria. Now, anaerobic means without oxygen. And if you've ever like walked through a lawn or area that's been saturated for a long period of time. Maybe there's a leaking valve or a slow leak on a sprinkler, and there's just an area that is just like filled with water, and the soil is 100% saturated with water. If you've experienced that, there's a smell to it. It's a yucky smell. It's an aerobic conditioned smell. And what that indicates is that there's bacteria that are thriving in the absence of oxygen. Bacteria that are thriving in the absence of oxygen. And those are typically non-beneficial bacteria. Those aren't good for plants. Those are not bacteria that are changing or converting air nitrogen into plant available nitrogen for the plant. These are non-beneficial bacteria that usually end up giving plants diseases and killing them out. So if you do a compost tea and you actively aerate it, that compost tea itself will last longer. Usually shelf life of a compost tea is only 24 hours. But if you do active aeration in a compost tea, you get much better effects because the bacteria that are present are in like high activity alert. Okay. So simple way to do it, backyard approach, totally works. If you're looking at doing this at a little bit more impressive scale, active aeration. This is an example of organic lawn approach and utilizing compost tea side by side. Okay, so there's amazing results. Essentially, you're just inoculating the soil with high levels of bacteria, of beneficial bacteria, as well as really good organic nutrients. So great alternatives there. And this isn't just for lawn. You can use it for all plants, really. Another approach is grass cycling. Okay, grass cycling. So grass cycling is leaving the clippings on the lawn after mowing so they decompose and release their nutrients into the soil. You might think, well, that's weird. Well, it's not that weird, right? A lot of times you see landscape professionals out there with big mulch bags. You're seeing it less and less often, but typically people think they have to collect the lawn clippings and put them into the organic waste bin or haul them off in burlaps to the landfill. Well, think about it. Within that leaf that you're cutting off, there's nutrients and there's organic matter in it. And lawn by dry weight is 0.4% nitrogen. Lawn by dry weight is 0.4% nitrogen. The rest is essentially carbon and organic matter, right? It's organic matter. And what does soil like? It likes organic matter and it likes carbon, okay? So instead of clipping it and hauling it off somewhere, clip it up really finely and leave it in place. And it will in turn decompose into that soil in place and increase nitrogen levels, which we're coming in all the time to try to increase nitrogen levels with our quick release fertilizers, right? So grass cycle is a great approach. Now, ways that we can successfully do this: mow often and mow dry. Aim to mow no more than 1/3 of the leaf blade surface. Schedule mowing on days the lawn is not irrigated or later in the day once it's dry. The reason you want to do that is if you try to grass cycle on wet grass, then a lot of times those clippings will have a tendency to clump up. And when they clump up, they fall onto the grass in clumps, of course. And when that happens, that clump will block sunlight from the lawn below it and essentially kill that portion out. Okay, so we need it dry. And the reason we're removing 1/3 of the blade is that is the typical, right? With any kind of pruning activity, except for peaches in the summer or in the winter time, where you're pulling off like almost 90%. This is a great rule of thumb for leaf blade removal, right? You don't put the plants into shock by removing an excessive amount of their ability to photosynthesize, because remember, photosynthesis is the plant making the food for itself. And so if you remove that ability by too much, that plant cannot make enough food. So you need to be really cognizant of how much it's doing. Maintain and adjust your equipment. A clean cut minimizes water stress. So that means sharpen your mower blades. And then under the mower deck right here, if it's caked with a bunch of lawn clippings from like 10 weeks of mowing lawns, then as that those clippings flip around above the blade in there, it's just going to get chunkier and chunkier. So keeping it really clean provides a better ability of that lawnmower to disperse uniform lawn clippings. Okay. Now let's look at some nutrient deficiencies. Is this a deficiency? I would say, yeah, there's some sort of deficiency going on here, right? This looks like a rhododendron to me. I'm not positive, but it looks like a rhododendron. And what I'm seeing in this is uniform chlorosis on the older leaves. You can see that these most likely are the newer leaves, this year's growth or recent growth. And then these older leaves are chlorotic, but the newer leaves are not. That's a really good indicator that that is a nitrogen deficiency. What is that? Right? These little spots, like this could potentially be some sort of like really specific micronutrient deficiency, right? Or it could be either frost damage or hail damage. Okay, so be careful when you're looking at plants and you're just automatically labeling it as, oh, this is an iron deficiency or a manganese deficiency or whatever it could be, right? Because it could be an abiotic plant disorder that's not associated with nutrient deficiencies, okay? What do we got here? Chlorosis, leaf scalding, curling, maybe happening on trunk 2. Is this a nutrient deficiency? Oh, this is sun scald. Okay. Now, difference here is that uniformly and throughout the plant, we see this deficiency on specific leaves on both sides of the plant, whether they're on the shadier side or the sunnier side. In this case, we're looking at a really weird, really specific chlorotic pattern, really weird, really specific drying pattern or desiccation pattern. And more than likely, this is the side that receives the full sun. Okay. So again, be careful when you're looking at plants that these are, we're talking about abiotic plant disorders. These are plant disorders or diseases or problems, really disorders that are caused by non-living things. Okay. It's not a blight. It's not a root knot nematode. It's not like any of those weird pests out there that are really damaging for our plants. There's something that's not living that's missing or in excess, abiotic plant disorder. So again, be careful when you're looking at plants and trying to diagnose what's happening, that you don't diagnose this as something else. You have to look at the whole plant, where it's happening, etc. Now, this right here, I see really often. I pulled up like a little, there we go. It's the shopping center by my house. And this is a great like example. Here's what we've got. These are all tulip trees, Liriodendron tulipifera. Okay, so this right here is a tulip tree. You can see on these tulip trees that there's this severe scald here, like this like slash of like dead stuff. And that these, remember when we talked about the cork cambium, right? There's a major injury here, and the cork cambium is trying to roll over that injury. Okay, what caused that injury? Well, that injury was caused because it is completely exposed to the sun to the south and that sun's reflection off of really hot asphalt onto this trunk. This tree will never truly recover from this. It's probably strong enough, but this is pretty damaging. Okay. And if I can point one other thing out, what a horribly idiotic spot to like not think of this, right? In an area where cars park constantly, they put a plant that is very susceptible to sun scald that could potentially damage and disease that plant, and parts of that plant could fall onto the cars that are parked below it. Ooh. Now, across the way here, we have the same tree, same southern exposure. Let's zip over here real quick. I don't see any of it on that. Why is that? Well, reasons could be, right? You see these two, same exact things, same exposure. Reason could be, A, they put a little blanket over this one in the hot summertime while it was developing. It could be a reason, but it wasn't. The second option would be, well, that's actually shaded. So in the really hot times of the year, these plants are shading this asphalt and the base of this plant. So this is not getting that sun scald. Okay. So keep your eyes out, right? We see a lot of this. You see some other plants in here. These are not Liriodendron tulipiferas. These are not. These over here are, I think these are all pears. And these ones don't show, these ones don't have this sun scald on the other side. Let's go over and check, make sure. Right? No sun scald. Now, the reason for that is these trees are less susceptible to sun scald than these ones. Okay, so really understanding your trees, what their capabilities are, what the susceptibilities are. It's not rocket science, but it can get pretty complicated. So sun scald, not a nutrient deficiency. This one, interesting. It's not yellow, but there's chlorosis. Okay, it's not yellow, but there is chlorosis. It's not uniform. Right? Sort of mottled through here. And it's not in or adjacent to the veins. Okay, you can see green in those veins. So chances are, I don't know this for sure, but chances are this one is more of a phosphorus deficiency. Okay. Oh, no, sorry, potassium deficiency. Okay, chances are this is a potassium deficiency. These are complicated. These are challenging to identify. The more you observe, the more you note, the better off you are. Other, we've got last one here. And is this a deficiency? Now, looking at this, you see it's not uniform on the plant. It's kind of on one side or one section of the plant. What could be causing this? What could be the cause of this injury to this plant? Well, I don't think it's a nutrient deficiency, like I said, but what could be causing this? Well, I can't identify where this is, but this one looks like a lot of pine trees, potentially an area where it does snow in the wintertime. And for snow and ice control on roads, they use salts in sand. Okay, they put that on the roads, and what that does is that dissolves the ice. But as snow plows come through here and it pushes all that to the side, it can pile up against plants. This is salt injury. Okay, and chances are this is as well. They've probably been using salts to de-ice this sidewalk here, and that's the result. Okay, so a lot of interesting, weird things, nutrients, understanding them, and a sort of a high level of understanding what they do, what each one does for the most part is important with what we do, but it does get super duper complicated. like really complicated. Anyways, that is intro to nutrients. That's kind of where we'll leave it. From here on out, in the next module we're diving into is really plant cultural conditions, sun, soil, water, and there's a couple others that you might not like think of, but there's some really important ones. So next lecture, we're diving into cultural conditions. This lecture was nutrients. Key takeaways on this lecture. What is humus? Humus is an organic material that forms in soil when plant and animal matter decays. What is compost? Compost is the end product resulting from the controlled biological decomposition of organic material from a feedstock into a stable humus-like product that has many beneficial environmental benefits. Compost tea as an alternative, grass cycling, remember 0.4% dry weight, and then really looking at the macronutrients and the micronutrients, right? And what they actively do and what for the plant, primarily the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then some basic symptoms of those deficiencies. And then also being cognizant and aware of recognizing whether it is a nutrient deficiency or some sort of other abiotic plant disorder, mechanical plant disorder, etc. And then finally, how we figure out how much fertilizer we need to put down in order to apply a certain decided upon amount of nitrogen or other nutrients per 1,000 square feet. And that's it. Thank you, guys.